Okay, so you don't see irrelevant things. That's most things. You do see things that move you forward, and you do see things that get in your way. And in the class of things that get in your way are indeterminate occurrences, novel or anomalous occurrences. And almost everything that gets in your way is in some sense a novel occurrence, because you usually structure your behavior so that you don't go anywhere where something wildly anomalous is likely to occur. So if you encounter an obstacle, two things happen at the same time, and one is that your movement forward to your specific goal or sets of goals is blocked. But the second thing that happens is you're faced with a mystery, and the mystery is this thing wasn't supposed to exist, but it does exist. So what implication does that have for everything I think? And that's very, very hard on people. They do not like that at all, and no wonder, because it's the constrained chaos that's underneath everything, inhibited by your contextual knowledge, that suddenly popped its head up into your world. It's like the shark in the movie Jaws, which is of course a mythological story. It's exactly that, and it's exactly what that movie signified. A safe vacation paradise, all of a sudden threatened by some subterranean thing that can pull you down, and that destroys the peace and the harmony of that particular community. It's a dragon story. It's a hero myth. It's the story that people have been telling forever. And what you can think of that thing that reemerges, that shark that rises up from the depths, or that whale, or that dragon, or that predator, or the foreign invader for that matter, or the barbarian. They all fit into the same category. That's what had been deemed irrelevant suddenly manifesting itself. And when you think about how much is deemed irrelevant, the fact that it suddenly manifests itself, that's exactly the purpose, for the reason for the trauma. It's like, well, I've eradicated from my conceptualizations 99.99% of everything. It's zeroed out, and all of a sudden I've made a mistake. Bang, I don't know where I am. Well, what's relevant when you don't know where you are? And the answer to that is, since you don't know, everything is relevant. And you can imagine the sort of terror that people who experience paranoid schizophrenia are living in perennially, because what happens to them is precisely that. They undergo neurophysiological transformations that makes everything that they once depended on disappear, and everything comes back as relevant. And that puts them in the early stages of schizophrenia. That's extraordinarily stressful neurophysiologically. So they're overwhelmed with cortisol, and their brains deteriorate as a consequence of that. It's just too much. So, and unsurprisingly, right, because you can hardly deal with anything, let alone with everything. Now, and often what you see, and it's rarely conceptualized this way in the training of clinical therapists, but often what you see when you are dealing with people who are in crisis isn't people who have a mental illness. In fact, in my experience, that's actually quite rare. What's far more common is that the person that you're talking to has become overwhelmed by catastrophe. So their life has fallen apart in some way that makes what they're doing actually impossible. So maybe someone very close to them in their family that they were depending on has developed a very serious illness, and that's thrown their entire financial state into utter chaos. Or maybe they've developed a condition that makes it impossible for them to work. Or you can imagine the potential range of catastrophes. And they're coming to see you because they're anxious and depressed, but the reason they're anxious and depressed is because everything they have ignored has popped its head back up and is hell-bent on their destruction. And often you see people who are being attacked by 5 or 6 of these monsters at the same time. And it isn't their mental illness that stops them from being able to deal with it, although that, whatever weaknesses you have are going to interfere. It's the fact that what they're facing is no damn joke, and if you were facing it, you'd feel exactly the same way. So then you're trying to come up with practical solutions to these tremendously complex problems. And that's well, it's extraordinarily difficult, generally speaking. People often don't come to a therapist until they've exhausted their entire range of resources. They cannot figure out what to do. And so, in a situation like that, you can administer antidepressants, and maybe that'll help the person increase their stress resistance. But and it may be that because they're depressed and have been brought down, that they are in fact exaggerating the danger of some of the smaller monsters that are after them. but making the person more stress resilient doesn't give them, for example, a new job, and it certainly doesn't bring back the person they've been living with for 2 years who has a degenerating neurological disease or some form of cancer. Like, these things are major. You know, I often see people who, well, they're in a relationship, maybe they're rather isolated, older people. One of the partners is dying and their entire financial situation has become catastrophic. It's like, that's not a mental illness, man. I mean, they may have got into that situation because of one inadequacy or another, but you don't even want to push that too far, because that sort of thing can happen to anyone, and will in fact happen to most people in one form or another, at least at some point in their lives. So you want to be damn prepared for that. You want to be prepared for that, because it's bitter and harsh and anxiety provoking and painful. But if you're not ready, then it's also hell. And often you can stop things from becoming hell, even though you can't stop them from being bitter and painful and anxiety provoking and all of that. You can at least delimit the catastrophe enough so that it doesn't permanently bring you and the people around you down. And that's not so bad, right? That's a hell, or at least it's a lot better than the alternative. So this is the problem, you know. Things object, things are obstacles. Well, how big is the obstacle? It's the same question as how big is the predator that's lurking outside the door of our cave. It's exactly the same problem, except conceptualized abstractly, and I would say exactly the same systems that your distant ancestors used to conceptualize the lurking predator are the systems that are activated now when you encounter the re-emergence of all the monsters that you've ignored. It's the same neurological platform. You think, well, how could it be otherwise? Because evolution is a conservative process. Everything about you is built on ancient foundations, right? Very little new, certainly very little radically new comes into existence. It's mostly tinkering with structures that have been around forever, like your body plan, for example. That's unbelievably old. I mean, you share that with lizards, roughly speaking. So it's incredibly ancient. And by the time the Soviet Revolution came around, which would be at the latter part of the 1910s, after the First World War, the peasant class had actually established farms, of course varying productivity. Some of the peasant farmers were very, very good at being farmers and produced a huge proportion of Russia's and the Ukraine's food. Because one of the things, we'll talk about this later as the class progresses, one of the things that you'll find if you look at creative production in any domain, it doesn't matter, artistic domain, food production, novels written, novels sold, money generated, number of companies generated, number of goals scored in hockey, etc. Or number of paintings painted, number of compositions written, anything like that, where the fundamental underlying measure is human productivity, what you find is that a very tiny percentage of people produce almost all the output. It's called a Pareto distribution, P-A-R-E-T-O. And it was studied in detail in scientific productivity by someone named de Sola Price. It's a square root law, so here's the law fundamentally. If you look at the number of people who are in a given domain, who are producing in a given domain, the square root of the people produce half the product. So that means if you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work, but if you have 10,000 employees, 100 of them do half the work. Right? It's a very, very vicious statistic. And you won't learn about that in psychology for reasons I have no idea about, because you learn about the normal distribution and not the Pareto distribution. But Pareto distributions govern, for example, the distribution of money, which is why 1% of the people in the general population have the overwhelming amount of money, and 1/10 of that 1% has almost all of that. Right? So I think it's like the richest 100 people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2.5 billion. And you think, well, that's a terrible thing, and perhaps it is, but what you have to understand is that that law governs the distribution of creative production across all creative domains, right? It's something like a natural law, and we'll talk about that more, but imagine what happens when you play Monopoly. You've all played Monopoly. What happens when you play Monopoly? One person ends up with all the money, all right? Then you play another game of Monopoly. What happens? One person ends up with all the money. It's actually the inevitable consequence of multiple trades that are conducted randomly. So if you take 1,000 people and you get them to play a trading game, you each give them $100, say, or $10, and they have to trade with another person by flipping a coin. I win the coin toss, you give me $1, you win, I give you $1. If we all play that long enough, one person will end up with all the money and everyone else will end up with 0. So it's a deeply built feature of systems of creative production, and no one really knows what to do about it, because of course the danger is that all the resources get funneled to a tiny minority of people at the top, and a huge section of the population stacks up at 0. But to blame that on the oppressive nature of a given system is to radically underestimate the complexity of the problem. No one actually knows how to effectively shovel resources from the minority that controls almost everything to the majority that has almost nothing in any consistent way, because as you shovel money down, it tends to move right back up, and it's a big problem. Anyways, the reason I'm telling you about that is because after the peasants were granted their land and started to become farmers, a tiny minority of them became extremely successful, and those people produced almost all of the food for Russia and the Ukraine. So what happened in the 1920s when bloody Lenin came along and collectivized the farms was that they defined the kulaks, who were these tiny minority of successful farmers who maybe had a brick house and were able to hire a couple of people and had some land and some livestock and were very productive people. They defined them as socially unfriendly elements, and they sent groups of intellectuals out into the towns to collectivize the farms. And so the idea was that, well, you would pool your land and everyone would farm it collectively, and the land was taken away, of course, from the tiny minority of people who were actually productive and had actually managed to own much of the land. So you have to imagine how that would occur. Okay, so it's in the 1920s, it's after World War I, Russia's in pretty bad shape, the villages are full of brutalized men who have post-traumatic stress disorder, and lots of people who are not doing well at all, and the bloody intellectuals come into the town and they say, you know those successful farmers up the street that you've always been pretty jealous about in your useless manner? Well, they're actually pigs and demons who are stealing from you, so why don't you come out, we'll form a nice little mob and we'll take everything they've got. And that's exactly what happened, and all those people were killed or raped or set off to Siberia in the middle of the bloody winter where there wasn't even anything for them anywhere for them to live or anything for them to eat, so they all died. And then the consequence of that was a few years later, 6 million people starved to death in the Ukraine. So in the Garden of Eden, there's Adam and Eve, right, the primordial human beings, and there's a walled garden, that's paradise. Paradise means walled garden, and Eden means well-watered place. And so there's this idea that the proper habitat of human beings is an amalgam of social structure and nature. And that's exactly right, because that's what we live in, right? We never live in nature, and we never live in society. We live in an amalgam of society and nature. That's the human environment, so it's a walled garden, all right? And so it's a productive, well-watered place where we could thrive. It's safe, and it's ruled over by a father figure in this particular story. And that's like you could think about that as the spirit of civilization. That's at least one way of considering it. So, well, there's a snake in the garden, and it's there unbeknownst to God, roughly speaking. Although he knows everything, so I guess he probably knows about the snake too. And he tells Adam and Eve not to interact with it. Fine, and they do, and the snake wakes them up, right? Because when they interact with the snake, they're given a fruit that opens their eyes and makes them aware that they're naked and vulnerable, and then dooms them to work. Well, I'll tell you the whole story much later in the course, but I want to give you an overview of it now. But then there's this really strange idea that developed over the course of the development of not only Christianity, but Judaism and a number of other religions that fed into the mainstream of Christian ideas, including Zoroastrianism. There's an idea that emerged across a very long period of time, that the snake in the garden was the same as Satan, the source of all evil. And I've been trying to figure out for the longest period of time, why in the world the manifestation of what's essentially a representation of a predator, so that's this snake, and you know, the snake is associated with trees. Well, yes, the reason for that in all likelihood is that we dwelt in trees. Right, and snakes like trees, and they're around trees, and they can climb trees, and the snake was a typical predator on our ancient relatives. But And so that's fine. So you can see that that representation makes perfect sense. There's predators that lurk in the garden. Yes, obviously. If you interact with them, they wake you up. Well, they better wake you up, because if they don't wake you up when you interact with them, then you get eaten. So it's probably just as well to wake up, even though there's painful consequences associated with becoming conscious. And that manifests itself immediately in the story of Adam and Eve. But then there's this weird association. It's very undeveloped in the biblical stories that are part and parcel of this line of thinking. It was more like a consequence of a cloud of mythological stories that surrounded it. But the reason for that, I think, is that imagine that what human beings were trying to puzzle out was the nature of the predator. Okay, so on one level of analysis, the predator is the thing that slinks along the ground and that threatens you. And also it's the thing that's your mortal enemy and that wakes you up. But then that's one conceptualization of predator, and fair enough. You can identify it and you can take precautionary measures. But a better conceptualization of predator might be, where does it come from? Let's say it's a snake. Well, there's a lair of snakes somewhere. And so if we want to get rid of the snake, we shouldn't be conceptualizing it as a snake. We should be conceptualizing it as one manifestation of a lair of snakes, and what we should do is go down, follow the damn snake wherever it goes, and find its lair and wipe out all of the snakes. And that's a more abstract representation, right? It's not predator anymore, it's the source of predation. And so if you want to solve the predator problem permanently, you don't kill the snake, you get rid of all the snakes. Okay, so fine. So, and people are pretty damn good at that. And that's why you have stories of people like St. Patrick, who chased all the snakes out of Ireland. And all sorts of saints were snake eradication saints. And, well, there's a variety of reasons for that. But then you might think, okay, well, the worst predator is the lair of snakes, right? But then you might think, well, wait a minute. The worst predator isn't the lair of snakes. Maybe the worst predator is the enemies that come to attack us. And those are human enemies. And so what we do is we defend ourselves against the human enemies. We put walls around our cities. We fortify our land, and we defend ourselves against the evil that's lurking in other people's hearts. And so that's like a higher order snake. And then we build these walls around us, and what's inside gets larger and larger and larger. And then what happens is the snakes start popping up inside the cities, because, you know, we've pushed all the, we've protected ourselves from all the evil that lurks outside, but we've now created a space where that evil can manifest itself inside. So there's criminals inside the city, and there's people who want to bring you down, and there's malevolence within the city, not only outside. So then there's the problem of the snake that's closer to you. And then there's the ultimate problem, which is the snake that lives in your heart, right? And that's each individual's capacity for evil. And then that was conceptualized as a transcendent spirit, right? So that's the spirit of Satan, who's the adversary of the hero, the adversary of the hero. And that's why there's an association between the snake in the garden and this great series of mythologies about the existence of evil itself. It's a consequence of our continued capacity to abstract. We started using the predator detection system to detect snakes and maybe, you know, predatory cats and maybe birds of prey and all that, but that didn't solve the bloody problem. Because just because you hid from the predatory bird today didn't mean the bloody thing wasn't going to be back tomorrow. And tomorrow starts to matter as you get smarter. And then once you're on that pathway and you're starting to think about, abstractly about the predator, the nature of what constitutes the predator starts to become, because you're trying to solve it across all situations simultaneously, it starts to become very much more abstract, and it ends up being something like a personality, like an eternal personality, and an eternal personality that has its effect on everyone all the time. So it's so interesting to see those ideas, because they basically evolved. People did not understand those ideas as they produced them, right? It was all put forward in a massive mythological context, in a rich, storied context. And the stories were as conscious as the information got. It was never articulated past the level of story. So, remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. There's a whole set of expectations that are governing what we're doing. Like, you don't want me to take your little tablet there and smash it. That would be shocking, right? You wouldn't know what the hell to do, right? You'd be somewhere different if I did that. And you wouldn't know where you were. And that's another thing to know, because That's a fundamental difference. There's a fundamental difference between knowing where you are and not knowing where you are. I think it's in some sense the fundamental difference. You can think about it as the distinction between explored and unexplored territory, but you have to I don't know if you've ever taken a cat to a new house. Cats hate that. And because in their old house, and maybe in their old neighborhood, they've slunk around, you know, at the edges, checking everything out. They start out afraid. They check everything out. They know where to hide. They know where to. They know what's safe, and they know that because they go somewhere and nothing happens, and so then they assume that it's safe, and they slowly build up a neighborhood that they're comfortable with. My dad used to take the dog for a walk, and then the cat got lonesome, and so it started to follow him. And first of all, it would just go along the buildings, the houses on their route, you know, hiding really from predators. And after a while, I got kind of comfortable with that, and then it would follow right behind the dog. But it had a border, and if my dad took the dog over one street too many for the cat would just sit on the corner and you know, cry like a cat cries. It was like, that's it for me, man. I'm not going any farther out into the unknown. And so the distinction between the territory that you have mastered and the territory that you haven't mastered is a fundamental distinction. It's the distinction between home and the strange land. And the thing about familiar territory for people is that most of the familiar territory that we inhabit is other people, because we're so social. So you can't really think, it's a weird way of thinking about territory. It's not exactly geographical objective territory, it's territory with a dominance hierarchy in it. And the dominance hierarchy has a predictable structure, and you know where you fit in it most of the time, and so that when you act out in that territory surrounded by your people, then often you get what you want. And you're so thrilled about that because you just don't want someone acting erratically around you. And you know that. So you walk down Bloor, and there's people there that should really be institutionalized, but we deinstitutionalized them all so they could be free, and free to be, you know, suffering and malfunctioning out on the street. That's what the freedom ended up being. But you know, you'll walk by someone like that who's muttering away to the voices in his head, and you know, maybe striking out against whatever it is that's plaguing him, and you won't make eye contact. You might even go across the street. You're certainly going to give him a wide berth. You're going to keep a distance between him and you, and you're going to hope that you don't attract his attention, because he's not in the dominance hierarchy, and you don't know what the hell he might do. And that's unexplored territory too. That's another way of thinking about it. Like, we inhabit time and space, not just space and not just time. We inhabit time and space. And our territories are spatial temporal. We're here now. And this is safe now. And it's safe partly because of the physical structure and it's working. But it's also safe because none of you are manifesting peculiar behavior. But if you started to manifest peculiar behavior, if you stood up and started muttering or yelling, or maybe attacking someone next to you, all the rest of you would freeze first, because then all of a sudden this would be unexplored territory. The match between what you want, which is a peaceful lecture that you hope has some content, the match between what you want and what's happening has vanished. And so then you don't know where you are. And so then what do you do when you don't know where you are? What do you do when you don't know what to do? Well, if you're a computer, you just crash. But, you know, what good is that to you? You're just going to die? That isn't helpful. You freeze first, and then maybe you cautiously attend, or maybe you don't. Maybe you just keep your damn eyes averted and you sit there and you hope that no one notices you. That's a prey response, right? That's like a rabbit frozen when it thinks a fox is looking at it. And we were prey animals for a long time. There was a cat that they recently discovered, a prehistoric cat that had this bottom single tooth, and they found out that a human skull fit right inside its mouth, and so it could grab you here and pierce the back of your skull with its single tooth, and that's what it was evolved for. So, you know, it's under such conditions we evolved, and we're predators obviously, but we're tasty predators, and so other things were perfectly happy to eat us. And so when you're where you don't know what to do, you act like a prey animal. And that's probably what you should do, because maybe if you keep your head down and shut the hell up, there won't be any attention attracted to you, and maybe you'll get through it. You know, you might decide, unlikely, to intervene and take the guy down, but you would be the exception rather than the norm, and it's unsurprising.